Let's talk about keyholes. Hey guys, Steve Good here with the Scroll Saw Workshop. Had an email the other night. A reader was asking a question about how I hang some of the scroll saw projects that I make on the wall. And of course there's dozens of different ways to do this, but one of my favorite methods is to use what is known as a keyhole router bit. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to show you a little jig that I put together that makes using this keyhole bit a little bit easier. Now, what a keyhole slot is, it's a slot that's cut in the back of a project of some type with this keyhole bit, and the keyhole bit actually plunges into the wood, then it travels along the wood and comes back out in this case, and it actually leaves a slot in there. So let's zoom in here and take a little closer look. I'm going to give you a nice close-up look of this router bit. And again, this is called a keyhole router bit, and it's called that because the shape that it actually creates in the wood looks similar to an old-fashioned keyhole. But what this bit is, it's a T-shaped router bit that has knives on the top and knives on each edge and knives on the bottom of this T. And what this allows it to do is to cut in basically any direction. So the knives on the top we can use to plunge down into the wood to a certain depth, like right here. Once we get it to that depth, we can move the router along the wood, creating a slot in the interior, and then when we reach the end of the cut, we can either back this router bit up and bring it out the original hole, or we can pull it straight back up out of the second hole. Now you can cut these router or these keyhole slots in either direction. You can either do them from top to bottom of the piece you're trying to hang on the wall, or you can do it from side to side. I prefer doing it from side to side because what that allows you to do is once you've got your screw in the wall and you're hanging this piece, as you move this piece along, it captures the screw, but it also allows you to find your center of balance. So if the project's a little out of balance, you can move it over a little bit, and that's a little harder to do if you do the straight up and down cut. So I generally do side to side, and the problem with this is that when you put this in a router, a handheld router, and you plunge it into the wood and you start moving along, it's very difficult to keep that straight without some type of guide. Now, if you're cutting a board that has a straight edge, you can sometimes use the straight edge on your router, but that becomes a problem because you want to be able to space where the keyhole is, and a lot of times those straight edges that come with your router will make the keyhole cut too deep into the wood. Other times you have an irregular shaped piece of wood from a scroll saw project or whatever, and you don't have the ability to use a straight edge on it. So we need to find a way to hold this board down and run the router along it, creating an artificial straight edge. And that's what I've done tonight with this jig that I want to show you. Before we move on to take a look at the jig that I'm working on here tonight, I want to show you the router that I use to make these keyhole slots. You can use a full-size router, but it's actually too big for this job. It's cumbersome and it's hard to build a jig that we're going to build tonight around one of those routers. So I have one of these trim routers by Rigid, and I'll put a link in the description showing where you can get this. But the nice feature of this Rigid trim router is that it has an optional acrylic base that's 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. So it's nice and small, and it lets us create a smaller jig. Again, you could redesign this jig using a full-size router, but if you don't have a trim router, you might want to take a look at one. They really come in handy for a lot of projects, especially scroll saw type projects that are fairly small. Now, when you install the keyhole slot into the trim router, you want to take a piece of wood that's the thickness of what you're going to be cutting the keyhole slot in, hold it up against the base, and set the depth of this router bit to where you have a little more than 1/8 of an inch between the base and the bottom of the T of the router bit. And that gives you a nice deep slot, and one that's plenty strong. You could even probably go up to 1/4 inch deep, but I haven't found that to really be necessary. We're going to be doing this on 3/4 inch thick material tonight, You can use these keyhole slot cutters down to 1/2 inch thickness. You just have to change the depth. Actually, the depth of this one would still be fine for a 1/2 inch thick, but you may have to change the depth depending on the thickness that you're trying to put this slot in. Okay, let's move on and take a look at the jig that I'm going to use here tonight. And there's more than one way to make these keyhole slots. There's all kinds of jigs out there that you can build. This one just happens to be what I use. If you have a router table, you can do similar things on the router table. Again, it's easier because you're moving it along the router table fence. It's easier if you have a straight edge as opposed to a circle or an irregular shape. Now, so let's go back to that real quick. Sometimes if you have an irregular shape that you're going to cut out on your scroll saw and you know you're going to want to put one of these keyhole slots in it, it's easier to put the keyhole slot in it before you cut the circle out. That way you have the straight edge you can use if that's the method you're going to choose. So sometimes you can do that, but not always. So we're going to pretend like tonight you didn't have that option. So this is the jig. It's very simple. It's a rectangle with a hole cut out of the middle of it that I cut on the scroll saw. And that hole is 3.5 inches wide. Okay, so you don't have much play front to back. When you run the router along this jig, that's how it cuts the hole. All right, so we're going to come in, we're going to plunge into the wood, we're going to move to the other end of the jig, and then pull it straight back up out. Now, the length of the keyhole slot that you're going to be cutting will be equal to whatever distance you leave between the 3.5 inch base, or however long your base is, and the cutout. So in this case, I have a 2 inch space right here, and that's how long the keyhole slot's going to be. Some people prefer those to be a little shorter than that. If I've got room, I make it longer just to give me more room to adjust on the wall. So I'll put plans up on the website. You probably will have to adjust your plans depending on the router you use and the size of the acrylic base you have. But if you get this rigid trim router, it will come with this 3.5 inch base. Give you a little bit more detail about the jig. I've disassembled it here and I'll show you the parts we're going to use. Again, we've got the main body of the jig with our 3.5 inch deep cut by, in this case, 7.5 inches long. That's the slot that the router is going to run in. I have 2 adjustment slots right here that I've cut in using the scroll saw. And what those are for is to allow me to adjust the fence that sits underneath this back and forth. And that adjustment determines how far the keyhole slot is from the top of your piece. So we can have the keyhole slot down here very far, or we can have it up here very close to the edge. That's what these slots give you the opportunity to adjust. The fence, which rides underneath the jig like this, is the length of the jig. It has 2 holes drilled in it that are for the bolts we're going to put through it. On the other side, we've got the holes countersunk with a larger bit, and that allows us to take our bolts, put them through the fence to go flush or below flush with the bottom. We then can turn our fence upside down with our bolts sticking up. Our jig body goes on top of that. We have a flat washer, 2 wing nuts, and that's how we adjust and tighten the fence down. Now, if you'll notice on the bottom of that fence, I did not secure these bolts into there. You could epoxy them in. It makes it a little easier to get them tight, but I found that just holding the bottom, it doesn't have to be all that tight. Just holding the bottom of that screw while we tighten the wing nuts down is plenty tight enough. And if you want to make sure it's totally square, which you do, you can set it down on a surface like that, tighten them up, and then the back of the fence will be square with the back of the body of the jig. And then we can adjust it from there. So there's our fence that will run along the piece. Now let's go back to the fact that we've got an irregular shape. If we put this irregular shape in here, we still got a straight edge. So we've got the problem that when we start moving the router back and forth, this thing wants to move, and it's very difficult to get a nice straight edge. So what I've done is I've taken 2 small nails. Now keep in mind, this is going to be on the back of the project, so the fact that we're going to mar it just ever so slightly is really not a problem. So what these nails do is when we take our irregular shaped object, or for that matter even a square object or a rectangle, put it on here, when we push down on this, the 2 tips of these nails are just barely sticking out the bottom of the body of the jig. Not even a 1/16 of an inch out the bottom. So when we put this piece up against the fence and push down, that locks that piece in there where it's not going to move when we run the jig across it, or the router across it. So all we have to be aware of is I've got a center line marked here on the jig. So we would want to create a center line on the piece to center the keyhole jig, say like right there, and we want to make sure that it's going to be parallel to the top. So you're going to want to rotate this around until you're sure that the keyhole slot is going to be cut parallel to the top of the piece. We've got our mark now on the irregular shaped object. We've got our center line drawn here on the jig. We can pull this jig back to the edge of the table. Take a clamp, simply clamp it to our workbench like this. Make sure that's down nice and tight so that's being held in there. And now we've got a perfectly solid piece that we can run this router through. And even though we've got an irregular shape up against a straight edge, we're fine. Now we can take our router, and we've got our keyhole bit in it. And if we lay this router down, I've got the router adjusted back pretty far to where this keyhole slot is going to be right near the top of the piece. So what we can do is set it in here and make sure it's about what we want. And in this case, I actually need the piece to come up in a little deeper because the keyhole slot's going to be too close to the edge. So let me stop the camera here. I'll get it adjusted. We'll be right back. So what I just did, I loosened my 2 wing nuts. I pulled the fence back towards me, away from the body of the jig. Now when I put this piece back up here and center it up, now my keyhole bit, when I plunge it down, will be deeper into the piece of wood. So again, we can now clamp this to the workbench, push this down to make sure that the nails are grasping the piece, and now we can make the cut. Okay, I've got my headphones on. I just want to show you the technique one more time. I will generally take the edge closest to me, put it up against the fence. Before I turn it on, I will make sure that the bit is not touching the wood. I'll turn the router on, plunge it straight down, move it across, holding pressure against towards me against this jig. Once I reach the edge, I'll pull it straight back up. Just like that, we've got our keyhole slot routed. Let me vacuum this out and I'll show you the result. Here's the result. A perfectly straight keyhole slot, centered in the workpiece because we lined it up with our center line, and parallel to the top of the edge. It's just that simple. Now of course we can do the same thing with a square piece of stock. Simply we're putting the square piece of stock in there, same situation, adjust our guide and go from there. Because we're using these nails, if we wanted to, we could even cut our keyhole slot across the corner. So irregular shapes really don't cause us any trouble. These nails will hold this quite secure as long as the back end is clamped down to the bench. I have done this handheld without using a clamp here, and most of the time you can do it, but it's easier if you get this clamped down. So irregular shapes, straight edges, doesn't really matter, seems to work fine. Adjust the distance that the router travels in this slot to adjust the length that your keyhole slot's going to be. If you want to, you could actually build this jig to where you had inserts you could put in here of different thicknesses to change the travel, so you could actually have an adjustable length keyhole slot. I haven't gotten to that point yet because it doesn't seem worth the effort, but you could do that. If you're going to cut 1/2 inch thick stock with keyhole slots, when you slide the stock underneath the jig, you can see we don't have the balance, so you get two options there. You can either cut multiple fences, in this case you'd need a 1/2 inch thick fence to make this work, or you can just back up your 1/4 inch piece that you're going to cut with your 1/2 inch piece with a 1/4 inch piece, and then you've still got a jig you can run it across there. So that works fine too. So that's my little jig. Takes only a few minutes to make. You can make different sizes, depend on the size of the base of your router. You can change the length of these slots to change how far back and forth it moves, and again, you may have to do that if your router's of a different size. But that's it, simple as that. I'm Steve Good. Thanks for being here with me at the Scroll Saw Workshop. Catch you next time.